Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. Ladder Daily Digest is about honoring creators, whether you're a podcaster, a TikToker, or even an author. Today, we have the author of a book called Mythos and Cosmos, and the author is John Knight Lundwall. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Gene. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so first, let's get a sort of like a little bit of a life sketch, like it's your funeral, and what you would want people to say, what it took to grow into John Lundwall.
Well, first off, let me say I was young and I needed the work.
That's right.
I'm
like what state were you in, city were you born in, or whatever? Go from there.
Born in Utah, but raised back east, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. My father
was a coal miner.
My grandfather on my mother's side was. My father is a seminary institute teacher for the Mormon Church, and he did a lot of work back east, and so we traveled around. I actually spent every year growing up in elementary school in a different school because that's how much we seemed to bounce around. So my grandfather is N.B. Lundwall. He wrote 15 church books. So, I come from sort of the Mormon heritage tradition. And then, look, I teach at Pacifica Graduate Institute. That's the Joseph Campbell School of Comparative Myth in California. That's where I got my graduate degree. I got interested in the subject. Why get a graduate degree in comparative myth and religion?
Because there's so many job opportunities.
That's right. It's just everyone's knocking on my door. Sadly, and thrillingly, it's what interests me. I wish money interested me in law and business, but that doesn't interest me. What interests me is this work. And I can tell you that my interest began as a 16-year-old being raised in the Mormon faith. And that's when I decided, I'm going to read this Book of Mormon and check it out. And so I read it and I loved it. It was fantastic. It was a great experience. I had a spiritual experience, loved the text. Knew that it taught truth, but at the end of it, I had this reaction that perhaps the church didn't want me to have, and that is, that was so good. What else is out there? So I committed to read the scriptures of all the world religions. Of course, I was a 16-year-old Mormon kid. I had no idea what that meant, but I made that commitment. I'm just going to go out and look. And of course, I went on my mission, didn't do any reading of the world religions on my mission. But when I got back...
where'd you go on your mission?
British Columbia, Canada.
Okay.
Late 80s, 86 to 88. It's a beautiful province. And, it was a wonderful mission. My mission had everything in it, the ups and downs, the good, the bad. But I got home,
for your mission. Mm-hmm.
Went to BYU, and I was an English literature undergrad major, but I kept my commitment. I said, I'm going to start this. So I said, what book should I read first? And I realized I had never read the Bible cover to cover. So I started with my own faith tradition.
Which is almost English literature. Sort of.
Sure enough. No, the Hebrew Bible is literature. It's sacred literature. It's not, we could do a whole podcast on the genres of biblical literature.
Right.
Then after that, I went to the Quran. These are the religions of the book. There's a lot in the Bible I didn't understand. I had never read. I don't think many people do. I read the Quran, and there's a lot of that I didn't understand, but I could follow it along. But then after that, I was like, okay, let's read the Vedas. That's some of the earliest religious texts in the world. It's out of India, second millennium BCE. And so I actually got a annotated translation and sat down, began reading it. And, this is the 90s.
That's right. There's no Wikipedia where you can learn everything you want in 3 paragraphs.
That's correct. There is no Wikipedia. So I checked a book out of the library, the BYU library, and began reading. And, I don't know if you've ever sat down and tried to read some of these ancient texts, but I had no idea what I was reading. First off, all the names are unpronounceable to this kid growing up in Mormonism. I served an English-speaking mission, though I did serve for 2 months in a Chinese branch. I helped open the branch. So for 2 months of my mission, I didn't understand a word anyone was saying because they were all speaking Chinese. It fascinated me. This does not read like anything like the Bible or the Book of Mormon or the Quran. What is this? And so, from there, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Bhagavad Gita, then the Germanic, the Eddas, the Tao Te Ching. I did encounter wisdom texts like the Analects of Confucius. I was like, thank God, something I can understand. This actually makes sense. And it's quite pleasurable to read. But
in a way, that's almost like the Chinese version of Aesop's fables.
That's right.
Boiled down into nice sayings.
Right. Like Proverbs. In the Bible. Anyway, I then was introduced to all this mythological material. This was new. All these writings are polytheistic. They make no sense. Largely, the Mahabharata is a national epic, so at least there's a narrative that you can follow along there. But it's also from a Western tradition. It's very convoluted and hard to follow. So I began reading about ancient myth. So I started at 16 reading the Book of Mormon. I jumped to the world religious scripture. And then I'm like, I don't understand most of the world's religious scripture. It's mythological material. So I began reading Joseph Campbell. And as much as I can put my fingers on with ancient mythologies. Of course, I had also am reading the entire collected works of Hugh Nibley at BYU. So I'm reading Nibley and Campbell. And from there, I decided I'm just going to go to graduate school and really make a study of this.
In a way, reading Nibley is almost like reading a myth in that he's a mythical figure in the Mormon tradition. He's like the go-to, the father of all defenders of the faith, right?
For over a year, I would run into Hugh Nibley practically every morning. I had an early morning class in the Mazer building, and I would walk up the Southern Steps. And my class was early in the morning, 8, but I'd get there by 7. And so I'm walking up those steps, 6:30, 6:45. And Nibley is walking down the steps. He's coming off the campus. And I'm like, I recognized him. And of course, I'd say good morning. And he was always polite. But then, I began reading his books and attending some of his lectures. I attended some classes. I never actually took a class by Nibley. I just walk in and sit down.
But you had to get something a little bit from just passing him. Could you feel the energy?
He would always be reading a book while he walked. He trained himself to do that, but his head was in a book as he walked. Winter, summer, spring, didn't matter. And so I think that kept people from talking to him. But he had his head in a book almost the entire time.
Wow.
Look, he's probably one of the he's probably the smartest guy I've ever met. If you do read his work, it's very impressive. I have to say,
And I think, one thing I've been thinking about as well as, for basically 1700 years before Joseph Smith picked up a Bible, there had been Catholic and other Christian scholars going through word by word, discussing it, arguing points, theological clusters existed before maybe universities did, right? And they would be talking about all these different issues, right? Is Jesus a man or is he a God? And they would be working out all those issues for hundreds and hundreds of years prior to our existence. And so we, in a way, the Catholic Church got all the best ideas that they could together and just filtered all the other stuff out at the time. And then there were even more writings that are available, right?
Yeah, the literate class through the Middle Ages, that is your priests. Your priests are also your academics, right? So, I don't know how many. There were lively debates because there were church councils where, if you were on the wrong side of a lively debate, you could be, censured, or they'd say, look, this is the way. There's a debate, so let's make a decision and go with it. So that's what a lot of those church councils were doing. They were systematically correlating the material, right? I mean, there's no internet. 20 to 40% literacy rates, depending, in urbanized areas. So yeah, that's.
But I'm just saying it's been hashed out for 2 centuries almost.
It's been hashed out. Yeah.
So any other thing that's thought of is just building on all of that. So whatever Nibley did, it was based on something that was either formerly biblical or some other apocrypha or other types of things, And he could add his own stuff, but I'm just saying the foundation.
When I went to graduate school, I read a lot of Joseph Campbell, and of course, by the time I got to graduate school, it was already post Joseph Campbell. They weren't teaching Joseph Campbell. They had, it was post Joseph Campbell, but it didn't matter. I sat down and I read.
You were able to read his books, right? That he would read and write notes in.
That is actually one of the best things about my experience there is they had his library, his books, and I would go in there and pull the books he had read with notes that he had written in the books.
And stuff.
Yes, and I could go through his work, and I began looking at the books in the library and buying the books he had. And by the way, Nibley, I'd go to the Special Collections Library at BYU and do the same with Nibley. Most of Nibley's books are German and French, and but anyway, that was a great experience. The point I'm making is when you go to a graduate school for comparative myth, what you really are studying is comparative theory of myth. So I read a lot of different very smart scholars over the past 2 centuries. As you said, there's a lot of work pre-established. And after doing a lot of reading, I realized Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory, that all myths derive from this collective substratum coming out of the unconscious, had some really problems. I didn't like the monomyth theory. The mythologies come from so many different avenues and contexts, and so I was like, I disagree with the monomyth theory. And when I was able to articulate that, I looked at my shelf, and my eyes rested on my shelf of Nibley, And I said, oh, the mono-Mormon theory, because that's what
Mm-hmm.
Nibley had done. He had taken all this data from all around the world, you know,
A grand unifying theory.
a grand unifying theory, and he had turned it into the mono-Mormon theory, as in, a divine revelation at the beginning, priesthood keys being descended down through different cultures, different languages, different traditions, but he linked it always back, right? And so when I was able to deconstruct Joseph Campbell, that was also when I was able to deconstruct Hugh Nibley. And it turns out, in the 20th century, this overall theory of everything was quite popular in a lot of anthropology departments, history departments. And so, postmodernism was that thing which said all meta narratives are flawed. And of course, postmodernism begins with a meta narrative that says all meta narratives are flawed. So,
first thing you do is don't trust anything I say. Now, let me tell you what you should do.
Exactly. That's exactly correct. So, in any case, that was good. I idolized both these men, and you know what? I still love reading their work. But I was able to say, I disagree with a theoretical framework out of which you're working in. And what that did for me is, so what theoretical framework, no matter which one I pick, there's going to be problems, but how do I proceed? And so the way I decided to proceed was, I'm just going to pick a thread out of Nibley and a thread out of Campbell and a thread out of Harrison and a thread out of Levi-Strauss, and I'll weave them together and see what I can do to make my own rope with which to hang myself with. So
that's right. Someday when people say the Lundwall theory is washed up at some point, right?
Everybody gets deconstructed, but what I notice is that's okay, because if you wait long enough, everybody gets rediscovered.
Right.
So
the good old days.
That's right. So at some point, people get dropped, and then a century or two later, people are reading them again. So
that's right.
So
I guess you start writing papers, right? You're formulating this idea, and you want to publish something, right?
Yes. Yes, that's exactly correct. I am writing papers. Look, I'll tell you this little story. When I went to graduate school, I went with a couple really basic, I thought they were really basic questions that I wanted to answer up front, because I figured I could not really go down graduate level work without knowing some really basic things that I didn't know. And I didn't want to tell people I didn't know, but I was like,
right. You only wanted to know, why are we here and where did we come from?
No, what I wanted, I had read all these texts of world scriptures, and I was like, why polytheism? Why? I mean, why did that dominate the world? I grew up in monotheism, which was normal, and polytheism was so strange to me.
Right.
So I actually had a Post-it note. I had this board with Post-it notes with questions on them. And one of my questions was, why polytheism? And I was so naive. I just thought, I'm going to start graduate school. I'll go to the library there at the graduate school, ask the librarian, here's my question. Give me the books that the very smart scholars have already written, and I'll read, and then I'll answer these questions. So that's what I did. I went to the library and I said, okay, can you, let's not tell anyone I'm asking this question, but could you tell me why?
Right. My friend wants to know.
Yes, I'm asking for a friend. And what I discovered is there was no book. There's no book. I was like, what do you mean there's no book? This is the most basic question. Well, there's no one's written on that. You can read theories. I had to read, and anthropology and this approach and that approach and this theory of religion. And I'm like, oh, come on. Someone has got to have just worked it out.
That reminds me, when I got maybe a broader interest in books other than like Encyclopedia Brown, and I would read like people's like self-help books or something, and they would say, I looked for a book on this subject and couldn't find one, so I thought I would write a book about it. And that was sort of your experience.
Well, I didn't, well, actually in my book, Mythos and Cosmos, I do address white polytheism. So to me, as I was reading just a wide spectrum of, again, very smart scholars, I began just in my own field of comparative mythology, realizing there are a couple areas that the theorists have not addressed. One of which is orality studies. Mythology is a totally oral product. You would think that some of the major theories of myth would start with studies in orality, the epistemology of orality. Orality studies emerged in the 1960s, so it's coming late to the table, but, people like Walter Ong, Eric Havelock, Marshall McLuhan, Jack Goody, William Harris. So I was like, well, I got to read everything I can on orality studies. And at the same time, there was other lacuna in the theoretical models, including oral cosmology. No one was walking down that road. Why are there so many cosmological, astrological, astronomical motifs in this material?
Everywhere in the world.
Everywhere in the world. And it was so depressing when I realized I've got to learn freaking astronomy. I do not have time to learn astronomy. That means I have to go out, look at the sky.
You should have paid more attention in Boy Scouts when the astronomy merit badge was available.
I did pay attention in Boy Scouts. I can use a knife to whittle a stick.
There you go. You can rub two sticks together to create a fire.
I never got the fire, but I can rub two sticks together.
That's right.
So,
so something comes to mind. I've seen like the language maps where they're tracing things like Proto-European or Proto-Indo-European and stuff like that. Are you saying that before 1960 there wasn't that much around, or is it something around those things that they were developing new ideas about?
I don't understand the question. What are you asking?
So I've seen these maps of Europe and the Mideast, Asia, and they talk about how language maybe came from the Middle East, and there was Proto-European, it would be Indo-European, and then
that's correct, the Indo-European language.
Franc,
and there's different language families. And
the family tree. And
yes.
Are you saying that was all developed in the 60s, or were the 60s building on those
orality studies is when ethnographers began looking at, good grief, by the 19th century, there were scholars, Western scholars, who were visiting the last of the oral tribes, Siberia, Africa, right? Tribes that had no writing or contact with writing. So they're just, they're being met by Western scholars who create notes and journals. And people then began compiling that. And by the 1960s, there was basically a theoretical framework of, oh my goodness, oral people think differently than literate people. Orality structures thought. So it's not the language families, it's how oral societies, oral traditions collect and transmit information. But it's more than that. It's that they're, look, 99% of human history, Gene, is without writing. 99%. No one could read or write. And they're not illiterate, they're pre-literate. Pre-literate people have the same intellectual capacity as literate people. So illiteracy kind of is of a pejorative, but they have the same intellectual capacity. But when writing is invented, there is a modification to the software. Same hardware, different software. And it turns out over centuries, the differences become enormous.
So I can see a time in the future where they're studying things and somebody's going to say, hey, once the handheld computer was invented, humans got smarter. And you would argue to those future people, they didn't get smarter. They just had different tools to work with.
That's correct. That is correct. Look, the stone axe was, I don't know, invented. When was that? 50,000 BCE. It turns out it's not just a rock tied to a stick. There's a shape to it. It's weighted on the back, narrow in the front. Gives you,
it had technology.
Gives you more force. It turns out that design has never changed. The materials have changed. We now use, very nicely smelted iron and fabricated synthetic handles, but it turns out that the design has never changed. So, sure enough, there are huge differences in how oral peoples. When you have no writing, your referent of meaning is that which you observe, and so it was after actually, several years of reading this, I realized, well, to answer my question, why polytheism, when everything you observe is your primary referent of meaning and you have to pass that down to the next generation, there is a lot to pass down. When to hunt, where where the sun needs to be when you hunt, what you do when you hunt. Is there bait? Is there, right?
Where to migrate?
Right. When you migrate, where you migrate, domestication of crops, when you plant, when you germinate your seeds. I mean, it's actually because we get all our stuff from the grocery store, we forget that takes an enormous amount of intellectual sophistication, but also intellectual modeling. You've got to embed that information and pass it down generation to generation. Well, how the oral mind does it is it personifies every principle of nature and into a divine principle. So that plant there becomes a deity. And it's very often personified in dualities: male, female, light, dark, day, night. And so you have a male female deity, and that principle, that plant there that grows at this time with the sun there, well, when the sun's on that position, I'm going to name that a deity. And when the plant begins to sprout, I'm going to name that a deity. And then when I tell my narrative and relate the two, I am giving instructions on how to plant my seeds. And so polytheism is a direct result of oral epistemology. And I had answered my question over years of research. Oh, orality produces polytheism. However, I didn't answer that question until I had, I was like, why polytheism? Why polytheism? And the more I read, the more I realized I'm asking the wrong question. Polytheism was normal. 99% of human history was polytheism. The right question was, why monotheism? Where did that come from? Because that's brand new. And when I realized I'm asking the wrong question, the question is, why monotheism? And, and actually that's where orality and literacy help draw some of the contours. It's not the only thing, but monotheism is a product, certainly, of literacy, because when all your reference of meaning are tied to the landscape, to your agricultural cycle, just to organize and memorize all that, you're going to develop a polytheistic system. Monotheism is decoupled from the natural cycle. You read your monotheistic texts, and God is not an agricultural God, right? If you are passing down your technology of how to grow crops using your religion, which is 99% of human history, then your religion is going to be intimately tied to the agricultural cycle and thus be polytheistic or at least henotheistic. The first monotheism that really sticks, that becomes a religion of monotheism, is Judaism. And that happened late, and it happened after Jerusalem was sacked. The temple cult was destroyed because, as it turns out, what were the priests doing in the temple cult? They were doing sacrifices, but also running the agricultural cycle. We forget that religion and agriculture are wed together. So,
and that's where we see in the Bible, they are writing things. We have things that refer to the writings of 700 BC about, right? And that's when the Bible starts saying all these other gods are wrong. There's only one true God, basically, right?
That probably happens actually late.
Late, you mean like 300 BC?
Yeah, after the writing of the Torah.
Okay.
The first temple Judaism, the priests that were practicing the religion of Yahweh, first off, they were worshiping Asherah, the goddess. And second off, they probably accepted the truth and reality of foreign deities. They believed that Baal existed and Marduk existed and Zeus existed and Osiris existed.
Like our gods against your gods.
Yeah, you're right.
They still exist.
Right. They still exist. They're still real. When they lose their city, their temple, that's their religion. And they're exported as slaves. Now they're growing other people's crops. And they do make the leaders that are left make this radical decision. We're going to make our religion portable, because before you had to have the temple. Yahweh dwelt in the temple, out of which you operated your politics, your economics, your agricultural cycle, your religious sacrifices. The temple was necessary for that to happen. Suddenly, not only do we not have a temple, but we now realize we may never get the temple back. How are we going to function? And they make this radical decision. We are going to develop our covenant in a text writing. That makes our religion portable. And it sticks. I mean, it takes centuries, though, right? So, so there you go. The writing is wed to the monotheism.
So the writing was on the wall against polytheism. Get away.
Well,
but when did you when did you first start writing papers? And my assumption is that you wrote some papers, and at some point you thought, I could get all those papers together and pull them in a book. Is that how it sort of works?
Yeah, you write papers for your graduate school classes, and I won't lie, the last half of that book. So the first half of that book is my theoretical model, and the last half of that book is myth traditions. I write about the Epic of Gilgamesh, the labors of Heracles, and some Old Testament stories in the book of Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A lot of the material on the last half of the book was contained in papers I had written, exploring those traditions in my different coursework. The first half of the book, my theoretical model actually mostly occurred after my graduate studies, because you're in graduate school, you don't have time to develop your own model. You're reading everybody else's model.
Borrow somebody else's.
Well, I'm slowly putting all these things together. I'm, a thread from here, a thread from here, a thread from here. Right. And so, and even now, the book needs rewritten, because from when I wrote it to where I'm at now, I'm like, oh, I could have said this so much better in half the words.
Right.
So,
And I know that at scholarly conventions where you present things, there often are people that will argue, do counter arguments to try to refine, right?
all the
To
time.
strengthen
Yes.
the discipline.
To strengthen or demolish.
But I mean, it could demolish people, but it strengthens the discipline
It
overall.
does strengthen the discipline. Yes.
And so the main discipline is anthropology. That's the
Well, my degree is comparative myth and religious studies. So it's
is there another word I'm missing?
well, it is anthropology when you apply it to ancient cultures.
Right.
So
right, because it's not archaeology. That's the other word I was thinking maybe, but
it's not archaeology. But my degree isn't specifically anthropology. It's technically closer to philosophy. It's the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of myth. How do we? And so, in order to engage in that, we read lots of anthropology, right?
Right. Yeah, because you're talking about the story through the cultures.
Yes.
And anthropology is like what a culture was like.
Yes.
And that they would study over time or whatever.
Yes.
Okay, so it's related in a way, but it has a distinct thing. So, did you have people tear apart some of your early papers and make your feelings hurt?
Of course. you know, there's a great story here. So look, I'm the project leader of the Utah Cultural Astronomy Project. It's a group of researchers, and we go around, look at ancient petroglyphs in Utah, mostly from the Fremont culture. My research partner, his name's John McHugh. He's a registered archaeologist with the state of Utah. We go to these sites, measure, record, and we've, published some papers in peer-reviewed journals on our work. And one of the first papers that we submitted to an archaeoastronomy journal overseas, we got a rejection letter, which is fine, right? So we got a letter saying we received your paper, and we're not going to publish it. Doesn't fit us. Well, that was the first paragraph. The second paragraph of the rejection letter said, also, you shouldn't have written this paper. This was not a paper that should have ever been put to paper. And the third paragraph said, also, you shouldn't write papers.
Right. Become a plumber. We recommend.
Oh, actually, it was kind of eviscerating, but here's the deal. Had it been the first paragraph, I would have been, okay, so rejected and move on. By the, fourth paragraph, I'm laughing at the letter because it's so over the top absurd. I mean, I can no longer take this person seriously.
Are you almost thinking that one of your friends wrote it just to mess with you?
Oh no, the guy was pissed. The guy was angry that he had to read our paper. And, basically his complaint was we do zero rock art interpretation.
It's like that one quote from a movie.
Yeah.
I am dumber after reading your paper.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, no, that's exactly what he was.
His attitude.
That was his attitude. So what did we do? We took the paper and we submitted it to a different journal, the American Rock Art Journal. This is an A-tier rock art journal in the North America, and they published it.
They loved it.
They love it. So this is what happens. Of course, you meet people who disagree with your work, and I actually, of course, I don't care if people disagree. I want to improve my work, so poke the holes in it. Help me.
Right, but have criticism that we can relate to, other than you're ugly.
Well, right. Right. What I don't like is when this guy says you're an idiot, don't write any papers. I mean,
Ludicrous.
pisses me off. I'm like, oh, stop, grow up. Come on. We can do better than that. And you know what? Academia, you would like to think it's all a bunch of mature people in it to learn and to progress the field and help each other. No, that's not what it is. It's cats and dogs.
Just a bunch of juveniles that are now 50 and 60 years old.
There's a lot of great people in academia,
right.
and there's there's a lot of egos. There's a lot of politics. There's it's people.
Right. And when you set up a theory as like, yeah, everybody, this is the theory, and then somebody comes along and says, well, we should take another look at this. You're like going against their religion in a way.
That's correct. Oh, that's right. People have developed different kinds of models around which they've constructed their ideas of history and meaning. And so you tread on that. You got to do it carefully because, right. So,
so when did you start to think about a book needs to be written?
Well, in graduate school.
Okay.
When I walked in and said, why polytheism? And they said, well, there's no real book, but here, read that shelf. I was like,
right. And then what did you do? What did you do over time to did you have like a folder or a file cabinet that had a placeholder name, like the Lundwall theory of?
I did. It was called a swear jar. I did. Look, I just had these Post-it notes on this board for the longest time. And when I would kind of answer one of the questions on those Post-it notes, I'd create a little file. And I'd say, oh, hey, I'm going to put that Post-it note there. And I've got some ideas surrounding that. And it turned out to be actually quite fun. I mean, I can tell you, I don't know how long this podcast is, but
well, that's about it, everybody. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, at some point you're actually writing things on your computer, starting files, thinking about chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, or whatever. When are you saying, I've got to do it? Is that are you 30 or how old are you when you finally say, I'm going to get this done in 5 years, whether it kills me or not?
As soon as I finished my dissertation, I said, no one's going to read that. And by the time I'm done with, it took me almost 5 years to write the dissertation. And by the time I was finished with it and defended it, I was like, I already disagree with about 10% of it.
So you put it, you set it in some juice to marinate.
Yes.
Is that what happens?
Yes. And so then I was like, oh, I'm just going to start and rewrite something that is less academic and something I wanted to do.
Are you taking a year off and sailing across the oceans or anything like that to get away from it at all?
Year off. I always keep adding. I said, during this process, I had to learn astronomy. I had to read a whole field of academic work that wasn't assigned in my graduate school. I'm like, yeah, no, I never took any time off. I kept adding things. In order.
So about how old were you when it was shaping up so that you thought, 40, I think I'll be done in a year? I guess it was the year before this was published.
Yeah, no. I published that book in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, after writing that book, that's when I deconstructed the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm. Because you were thinking to yourself, gee, if there's 1,000 human philosophies out there and 999 are myth, why wouldn't 1,000 be myth? Right?
Actually,
the evidence is,
Gene, my line of thinking started as a proof for the Book of Mormon, because the Bible begins in oral tradition. You read Genesis; those stories aren't history; they're mythologized history at best, or just mythology. But that is a product of orality. That's what people were. And I realized the Book of Mormon begins in full literacy. Nephi is a fully literate scribe, and so is Lehi. And so it doesn't begin in oral tradition. So I don't expect to find a mythological content. And sure enough, when I read the Book of Mormon, it does not read like all the mythologies I've just spent years reading. It reads like history. So my first idea was, I don't expect to find mythology in the Book of Mormon. I do expect it to be history because it begins with literacy.
And it's the most correct book ever published.
Well, also I'm a TBM, and I have all these. Yes, this is the water I'm swimming in. It is Revelation. It's Joseph Smith. It's the mono-Mormon theory. I have to say, when I deconstructed Nibley, that was when I allowed myself to start testing my own ideas. And quite frankly, I realized, first off, the kind of literacy that exists in First Temple Judaism is not producing the Book of Mormon text. Furthermore, the Book of Mormon text is completely decoupled from nature. It's completely monotheistic and rooted in a Redeemer God and post-Reformation Christianity. And post-Reformation Christianity took the Middle Ages, all those centuries, to develop.
Right.
From orality, secondary orality, literacy, all these ideas. And it just became clear and clear the further I went that my original idea was to defend the Book of Mormon, but it became indefensible. I'm sorry, it's not history. It's not. And so
that's right. And so when did you self-publish, or did you have a publisher? Or
no, it is essentially self-published. It's Cosmos and Logos Press. There's a group of academics that were doing a journal, Cosmos and Logos journal, and I published it through that. But it was a small press that it basically took over because we had to end the Cosmos and Logos journal. And so I just published it through that.
So you go to your mom and you say, "Mom, I need $30,000 to get the money for this."
Well, if you knew my mother, you know that would be impossible. She would have given it to me had she had it. That's for sure.
Right. And so of course, nowadays the technology a lot of times is you get something in a PDF or whatever, and Amazon will just print it and they'll ship it off now for a lot of things. My understanding is
that is correct. Look, I had this. Yeah, I mean that's an argument that you have. If I would have tried to publish it with an academic press, but as it turns out, during this period of time, I had a nuclear bomb go off in my personal life, and so that actually altered the entire trajectory of my academic work. So you take the hand that you're dealt and you proceed.
That's right.
So I spent 7.5 years in litigation, criminal and civil court.
And that's another story.
That's another story, putting other people in prison, but that took an enormous amount of CPU space.
Right.
And I had to finish a dissertation, write a book, publish academic papers while doing that. It was extraordinarily, it was impossible. Also, founding board member of the Utah Valley Astronomy Club. So that's how I learned astronomy, as I went out and did it with professionals, and founding member of the Utah Cultural Astronomy Project. So I'm out there with rock art professionals and archaeologists, so
And are you teaching somewhere as well?
I teach at the graduate school that I graduated from.
Okay. And so I know that you've been in a lot of podcasts over the last year. I saw that you were on Mythbusters. No, what do they call themselves?
Mormonish?
No, before that, I think even Myth.
Oh, Myth Vision.
Myth Vision.
Yes, Myth Vision. That's actually a very large podcast with Derek.
Yeah, and Derek used to be Mormon, I understand. Or is that the one, or is there another one that's on the show that used to be Mormon?
No, I don't think he was ever Mormon.
Derek
Lambert with Myth Vision.
I might be thinking of another podcast, but yeah, they are pretty big.
Yeah. No.
So do you see a jump in sales?
I was on his podcast several times, but then he had a partner, and they kind of had a falling out. So I haven't been on Myth Vision for a while, but yeah, I did several podcasts. In fact, when I first published my book, the first people who called me was Mythicist Milwaukee. They're a international atheist group. And they're mythicists. They don't believe in the historicity of Jesus, but they called me and said, will you come and do a podcast on our show? And very bright, smart people, and I just showed up, and I disagreed with some of what they were pushing, and I agreed with some of what they were pushing, and it was a good show. And so anyway, and then
and you have recently been on Mormonish.
Yeah.
And Mormonism Live.
Yeah.
Anybody else that I'm missing?
I just did I do podcasts here and there. I've done them. I'm new to the ex-Mormon stuff, Gene. I just did a podcast for Interverse. It's like an intellectual new age group. Brave New History, which is sort of.
Are they spiritual but not religious?
I think they're into. I can't really qualify them because I don't really know, but they're into astrology and spirituality. The guy who interviewed me is very bright, articulate, well-read. Right. So you're like, this isn't, so I do stuff like that. I got invited. You're right on mythology, and everybody comes out of the woodwork because it turns out lots of people have put into ancient myth all of their theories of the ancient world. I've spoken at the Graham Hancock group, right? The
ancient aliens,
right? So they say, come speak and give us your spiel. And again, I spoke at one of those conferences when one of the the greatest. There's four well-known alternative historians: Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, Robert Schoch. John Anthony West spoke at that conference, and he got up and he just reamed me. Oh. He kept mentioning my name, and he told the entire conference how wrong I was. And I was sitting there going, yes, he's saying my name.
That's right. All news is good news, right?
I was actually quite thrilled. So in any case,
yeah, except for that poster on the postal service walls where you're the 10 most wanted, everything else is positive publicity.
I loved it. I actually met people there, again, in the alternative history space. They're like, we're doing a trip to Egypt and we're surveying, certain parts. Why don't you come with us? So I found myself in Egypt doing really cool studies. So, no regrets. And I
And
don't have to agree with them. I can,
do you have an event coming up in March?
I do. I'm leading a tour in the Yucatan. We'll be at Chichen Itza to film the equinox shadow, the serpent shadow that comes down the temple of Kukulkan, March 17th to the 23rd. Have a couple spots open.
The Yucatan is
come along.
Southern Arizona somewhere.
A couple of years ago, I led a tour to Chaco Canyon. It was actually fantastic.
I would not know about Chaco Canyon except for Ancient Aliens, actually, myself. But, and let's see, that reminded me, I was going to say something about Ancient Aliens. Oh, no, the myth. I was thinking maybe 5 years ago, I only know that Zeus is a myth because somebody told me. Right? If somebody had said, pray about Zeus, and if you get a good feeling, Zeus is your god. Right? If you get a warm feeling,
millions of people
and you're connecting,
pray to Zeus, and they did get a warm feeling. That was the lightning bolt.
That's right.
Of course. So sure enough, that's the other thing is, reading the Book of Mormon really excited me to explore the world's religions. And the more you explore, the more you realize the religious experience is universal. It's ubiquitous. And it comes with all kinds of methods and names and different deities and different. Right. It's this fractal cornucopia of experience. So,
yeah, and it's the human experience.
Yes. Yeah, in the end, Joseph Campbell got that right.
It's genetically positive trait to want to believe in your leader and do what they say, because then you won't eat that plant, and then you will do your agriculture at the right time. That stuff keeps your genes going down and down and down the genealogical path.
That is correct.
Right? And so,
it also
thank you so much.
Gene. It also can reveal the most fundamental secrets of the universe. And to know more, sign up on my Patreon.
That's right. Go to John Lundwall. Where is your Patreon? I mean, I'm going to look it up.
I'm just kidding. I don't have one.
Yeah. Okay. Sign up for John Lundwall. His Patreon is going to say Gene Judson's.
There you go.
At the bottom of my
go visit Gene
description. We'll have some links to some of John's appearances and his book, and if hopefully you'll get at least one more book sale, or if somebody out there doesn't want to buy it, I'll lend mine for a lending library for a small fee. Actually, I got into sort of this podcasting world as a bunch of steps that happened after a person who was an editor of a book, and I asked him how much he made for being an editor. The book was called Writing Mormon History, and I last week or so I put out his podcast with him, and he said they gave me a hardbound copy and a softbound copy. That was my pay. And if you promise to read it, I will send you my softbound copy.
That sounds about right.
That is the price I'm willing to pay. So somebody involved in the production of a book spent $7.95 in postage to get somebody to read it. And so, but anyway, hopefully I sold a couple of his books last week extra. And he's coming out with a volume 2 of it coming up soon. So we'll have him back on as well. So thanks, John, for explaining how John Lundwall came to write Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. Get it at Amazon. I think it only took like 3 days, I think, to come, which is another It's exactly what they would have had 50,000 years ago had they had the internet back then.
That's right.
They would have just done the same thing. And yeah, people have been smart all along. They did the best they could with what they had around them. And it's just people are working with different tools. In fact, I said to somebody, and maybe I said it to you a week ago, that in the Book of Mormon, when Joseph Smith says that there's a book of life written that includes everything that happened on the earth. If he had written the book now, it would say there is a hard drive that exists in the center of the galaxy, and on that hard drive is everything that has happened on earth. And that's the difference. What's the technology around, at the time? Thanks a lot, John, for coming on the show. I hope you had fun. I had fun. I always learn, from listening to my guests. And I kind of joke sometimes that I don't want people to learn anything on my show. I want them to go buy the book or go see the podcast and learn from everybody else. But you were able to squeeze by that little, the small print that I had, in coming on. But anyway, thanks so much for everything. And everybody like and subscribe, and look for more episodes coming up. And if you want, check out, I'll do a link to your event that's in the Yucatan, and we'll see if anybody else signs up for it. I think I know somebody that's going to go, and we'll see what happens. Have a good year, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.